Richard, thank you so much for joining us for this
pleasure.
Inaugural service of Pompey Sundays at home. It's really great to have you with us,
Thank you.
especially as this month we're celebrating LGBT plus month. Thank you so much. You've become a household name through television, through radio, through your books. And you're also a vicar, in fact, the only Church of England vicar to have had a #1 record. So, yes, where are you at the moment? Where are you speaking from?
I'm in my study in the vicarage at Findon. I'm sorry, I've got a needy dog who is being, I'll actually on my knee or else.
Welcome to join in.
Pongo, he's just being a bit annoying. I'm in my vicarage in Findon in Northamptonshire, Diocese of Peterborough, with Pongo and Daisy, who you know very well, because I think Daisy used to occasionally run into your room at Cuddesdon when she was living there.
She did. I had the pleasure of knowing Daisy at Cuddesdon, and I believe it's also National Pet Day tomorrow. So,
is it?
Both welcome on the call. Absolutely.
Oh, well, that's very good. And I'm doing, I suppose, what so many clergy are doing all around the country at the moment is I'm trying to find ways of doing what I need to do, deliver what I need to deliver, sustain and uphold what I need to sustain and uphold under these weird circumstances.
Yeah.
Which has been very challenging and actually in some ways very rewarding. But I just want to get back to normal, really. Yeah. Or just to be able to gather in church, sing our hymns, sing our anthems, make our communions, and just the everyday being together that I love doing.
And has there been anything that you as a church have taken from this that's good? Anything that?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think some churches, particularly churches which have less of an emphasis on sacrament and more of an emphasis on word, if you can have such a bold distinction, I think have probably done rather better in it because it's been a good kind of restrictions for preachers, if you see what I mean, because that tradition tends to be much more technologically able, if you see what I mean, and also much more willing and able to do what they need to deliver what they want to deliver in this sort of way. Whereas for kind of crusty old sacramentalists like me who like, the Mag and the Nunc and Matins and Evensong, it's harder really because I like being in the same place at the same time with people because it's not just about what we say, it's not just about our appearance, it's about actually inhabiting the same air. So we feel the warmth of each other, the smell of each other, just that presence, which never more so than in the Eucharist, actually. So that's really important for me and for what we do here in Findon. Although I have to say, we have morning prayer by Zoom, and it's been lovely. But I'm very lucky. I've got a brilliant curate who is very sadly coming to the end of her time as curate, about to be signed off, although I'm going to do everything I can to frustrate her future career and keep her with us forever. But she comes from lower down the candle than me, and I've learned a lot from her, actually. It's been really good.
I've been watching, as I think a lot of us have, It's a Sin. And it takes us through the whole kind of sweep of the 80s with a fantastic soundtrack and colour and freedom and life. And also the horror of AIDS and of how people were treated.
Yeah.
And this was a time for you when you were in 2 openly gay bands, Bronski Beat and the Communards. And does that series capture something of the pleasure and the pain and the agony and the grief of that time?
Yes, it's an interesting one. Anyone who went through the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, at the centre of it, as we were, it's very difficult to revisit that time, partly because it was just so traumatic and partly because I think it's the kind of experience which takes a long time to cook, to reach a form which is available really to kind of think about and question. So I think for lots of us, it was something that has been of necessity a bit buried, actually. And then 30 years later, Russell T Davies, there's no better person, no person better able to do it than Russell, I think, manages to get into 5 hours of drama on Channel 4, something that really was authentically of the time, I think, inevitably compressed and inevitably given in a sort of selective way. But I knew those people. I knew a Richie, I knew a Jill, I knew a Roscoe, I knew a Pink Palace. That was the world I lived in. And one thing I really loved about it was that he resisted the temptation to lapse into sentimentality or cliche. So there was lots of celebration. It was a time of riotous delight and limitless excitement. And he captures that too. I mean, it is unapologetically, it follows its characters onto the dance floor, but brilliant choices about, I love the bit where you go with Richie around the dance floor as he begins to find his way into London's gay life. And instead of having, the 130 BPM disco classics of that era, he plays hooked on classics, which is great because it gives a sort of slightly twee, but also epic dimension to what Richie was doing. And for someone, I was Richie, I was 18 when I came to London in 1980, and I hit the gay scene, and it was like being given a sort of adolescence that you hadn't been able to have until that moment. Our lives began in a way, or our adult lives began in a way when we hit those dance floors. And so that was incredibly intoxicating, and it was very powerful. And also it formed me really, really powerfully. I mean, people often say, it seems such a long way to come to being a vicar, country vicar from where you were then. But actually I learned what I learned about community then. And that's as fresh for me today doing what I do now as it was then.
You had a whole succession of chart successes, and you had a platform. Were you conscious at the time of using that platform to influence people's thought, or?
Gosh, no, I absolutely believed in popular music as a kind of entryist tool to evangelize a kind of complacent population into the imminence of the revolutionary moment in which all rights would be restored and all injustices reversed. And that would be economic, and it would be political, and it would also be gender, and it would be sexuality. So I believed in this kind of fluttering rainbow, hope for a new world that was just waiting to come into being, and that we could energize people into kind of embracing it and making it happen, which was a very ambitious wish to have. But no apologies for having a big ambition when you're 18, 19, 20. The world turned out to be a bit more intractable than that, and people more complex, and indeed everything more complex. And that's the world I kind of live in now. But bliss was it in that dawn to be alive.
You've been very open about your ambivalent attitude towards your own sexuality when you came out, that combination of the tension between the kind of cultural and campaigning aspect that you've just talked about, but also that feeling of being out of sync with nature somehow in yourself. And do you think it would be like that if you were doing it today?
I hope not. And my impression is that there are lots of people who arrive in maturity and discover themselves to be wherever they are on the LGBTQ plus spectrum. And for that just to be simply a sort of matter for discovery, not something which it results in them having to kind of leave where they come from, or fracture relationships, or make them feel judged by an unjust world. For me, it wasn't that easy. The 80s, I mean, it was only 30, 40 years ago, but it was a very different world. And it was a hostile world to LGBT people. And like lots of people, that took its toll, I think, in two ways. The first was, I think I absorbed at a vulnerable age, negative messaging. And once that's in, it's quite hard to get it out. It takes a lot of work. And in those days, gay people were routinely criminalized and seen as despicable and sinful and all the rest of it. So keeping that at bay was tough. As I've got older, I've realized another price that's paid for that has been that I put on armor in those years for the fight, had to, because it was a fight and you needed defense and protection, and you needed weapons too. And then when those immediate battles were substantially won, you'll feel a bit like the soldier in a time of peace, that what you have acquired in order to fight that fight is just kind of cumbersome junk. And also, I don't want to be armed for a fight all the time. I want to be vulnerable. I want to allow myself to feel wounds and to learn from that. And Jesus Christ wishes for us to have life in its fullness. And it's not just a warrior's life I want more than that.
Yeah. Talking of Jesus Christ, you started an atheist club. That's cool. But you've also said, and I love this, even when my countercultural kudos was at its height, there was always a vicar struggling to get out.
Well, it's true, isn't it? I mean, I was an absolutely fervent atheist, as only someone who acknowledges the power of faith can be. I've got a very good friend who's an atheist who comes from a rabbinical Jewish background, and boy, can you tell, because he has the kind of mental disciplines and analytical tools of a rabbinical heritage, but also he knows it's important. And our enemy is not the thoughtful atheist. Our enemy is indifference, I think. And I think I was a chorister when I was a kid. So from the age of 8, I was sort of, involved daily in religion and absorbing, although I didn't realize it at the time, through osmosis, like so many Anglicans who come up through that tradition, so much of our doctrine, lex orandi, lex credendi, and all that. So every time I sung a Magnificat, a little part of me was being formed, I think. Yeah. But consciously, it seemed absurd to me from the age of 8. I think it was one of the first things I ever thought was, this is absurd. My grandfather died when I was 8, very unexpectedly. And for the first time, I was confronted with the reality of mortality. And I heard people say what were intended to be comforting things, I think, about, eternity and all that kind of thing. And it just seemed to be a sort of desperate wish fulfillment, really. And I just thought, well, of course, this is a material world, like anticipating Madonna by 15 years or so. It's a material world. And to say otherwise is magical thinking, although I didn't use that phrase.
Yeah.
But of course, our religion was compulsory. I was at an English public school, so chapel every day and all that, plus extra for me as a chorister. Yeah. So we would express our kind of Bolshevik resistance by refusing to bow our heads. It was me and Porky Hamblin and Matthew Gamage. We refused to bow our heads in prayer or to adopt any pose of piety. And we played poker dice during sermons sometimes.
No greater rebellion.
It was a very public school sort of rebellion. But of course, what I intimated then and felt then, but didn't really admit to conscious thought, was I liked it there. I liked being in chapel. I loved the music. I liked the people. And what it had to say, there was something so powerful and mysterious that it stayed with me. And when I wanted that, I knew where to go to get it.
So when did you start paying attention to it?
Well, it was in my late 20s, and I was burning and crashing on my way out of pop music, like every pop star should do. And I kind of crashed quite badly. And at that point, I just knew that I tell you what, I started getting a sort of twinge, and it was a twinge for, when I was a boy, I think like lots of people, I think I sensed that you get it all the time. I mean, you must have, you work in a cathedral. People come to cathedrals all the time with no explicit faith at all, but there's something about the place that makes sense to people. They know that this is a place where you bring stuff, where you could light a candle, perhaps, not knowing maybe what you're doing, but it just feels fitting to do that. But there's stuff that fits there that won't fit anywhere else. And I kind of always felt that. And I wanted just to connect with it again. I wanted to sit at the back and allow whatever was brewing to brew. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I certainly didn't want to have a "do you want to know Jesus" conversation. But a friend of mine who was married to a vicar, a friend of mine who's a friend of a friend of mine who's married to a vicar, put me in touch with her, and I went to see her, and had a lot. Sarah Maitland, actually, who's a marvellous person. And she directed me towards a church which she carefully selected to suit what was immediately obviously my temperament and peculiarities. And she sent me to one of the most soaringly flamboyant high churches in London. And it was like kind of landing in your home airport.
Fantastic. And you said that there's a kind of echo was there about a kind of echo in coming out as a Christian? Because you said you kind of felt you really ambivalent about that as well, because you weren't sure what people were going to think about you. Yeah,
I mean, I'm by nature a timid and conventional person, but I am by conviction obliged to take a more confrontational position than I'm comfortable with. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's not an unusual thing, I think. So my instincts are fairly conservative and my convictions are radical. So I'm kind of used to that. And I sometimes wonder if coming out as gay, there's such an obvious parallel between that and sort of coming out as a Christian that I wonder if I just kind of like that. I don't know. But so I can remember one being in a pub and someone saying to me, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to university." And they said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Theology." And he went, "What, geology?" And I said, "No, theology." He went, "Geology." Couldn't hear the word theology. So as far as he's concerned, I think he probably thinks I'm off somewhere with a rock banging boulders in a wilderness somewhere.
So there was that frisson about being different again.
I think I like a drama, and especially a drama in which I was occupying centre stage was not for me, a fate that couldn't be borne, far from it. So I don't know. No, I mean, perhaps there's something in that, but actually what I really wanted was this enormous hunger to be met. And what I was hungry for was something that gave me solid assurance about our ends being beyond what we experience in the here and now. And that the promise of Easter is something which begins to transform our lives before we get there. And that, yeah. I think I'd always intimated that my sort of commitment to values. It wasn't difficult making a jump from where I was on the kind of secular left to being in the church. And, so much of the secular left in Britain anyway, as Harold Wilson said, owed more to Methodism than to Marx. And I think of the Quakers, or I think of the history of nonconformism in Britain, and I think of the impact the church made in the industrialized cities of this country. That's an easy narrative for me to fit into. Yeah. It's the difficult narrative, that's the interesting one, is when Christianity starts challenging you, and when you realize that the Jesus that you make in your image, as the sort of first century freedom fighter, doesn't cover it, that he's a much more elusive figure than that, and he's not there for you to get. He gets you.
And were you surprised by people's reactions to your overt change of identity?
I was touched, actually. Jimmy Somerville, who could not by any stretch of the imagination be described as someone to take a relaxed view about patriarchal systems of oppression like Western Christianity. He was I told him, and I thought, this might be difficult, but he was living in America at the time, and he sent me a copy of Liz Stewart's Lesbian and Gay Prayer Book with a very touching inscription, which was lovely. Mm. I think lots of people thought that it was maybe something that wouldn't stick. Mm. And I did a podcast the other day with a friend of mine who I've known for 35 years, and you're interviewed about your friend, and then they put them together, and then you listen to it back. And it was interesting listening to her, who I know very well, and how her realization that this was not a kind of idle holiday from the story of my life, but it was actually the story of my life. And that was, to me, it was, I never looked back. I never have looked back.
So you've gone from pop to pulpit, and you also take in panel games and Strictly and Saturday Live on Radio 4, which I love, and now stand-up comedy in Stand and Deliver, and through them all you seem to be very much yourself. Are there threads in you that kind of hold all those things together and make them authentic, or is it messier than that?
It's messier than that, but I've been around for a while now, and one of the things I learned from Christianity, and it gave me a sort of bravery that I hadn't had before, is there are worse things than making a tit of yourself, actually. And I've done that so often now that I've become not exactly inoculated against the sort of shame and disgrace that it might bring, but I'm not frightened of making an idiot. I shouldn't say tit, you know what I mean? I'm not frightened of making an idiot of myself. Yeah. And that has meant that I've been able to kind of boldly go when no one has gone before. And sometimes I think Christ would find it difficult to forgive my paso doble, let alone anybody else. But I enjoy, see, one of the things I love about being a priest is that you do get a passepartout. Because you're weird everywhere, it means you can go anywhere, actually. and I'm sure you found this, if you've got a dog collar on, you can walk into almost any situation and people will not challenge you.
Yeah.
That you just seem to have a reason to be there before you've even tried. And so I've quite happily gone wherever I've wanted, really. And also, God hates nothing that he has made. And I think one of the problems we have, it's such an obvious thing to say, but I think it's true, is that we have become marginalized. And I think we are perhaps less bold with our itineraries through things than we used to be. And I often think of those mission priests of the 1870s, 1880s, who went out from Cambridge in their beards and their +4s and paddled up the Zambezi in canoes, full of passion for the gospel. And the night was dark and the jungle was menacing and they didn't really know what they were doing. And I bet they wondered, what am I doing here? And will this work? And some of them, for some, it ended bloodily and awfully. And they were part of a project that was, to put it at the very mildest, ambivalent. But I sometimes feel like that, except it's just a different, sometimes hostile environment that I find myself in.
So do you think the countercultural kudos has continued, or has it turned into something else?
I think I've become, David once described me as a borderline national trinket. And I think what he was getting at is that because I've been around for a long time, and because I'm a publicly identified vicar, I start to think that perhaps I could just float along on a current of whimsy, and people would go, "Oh, nice sticker." Da, 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 da. So I do try to disrupt that by injecting some reality into that narrative, which is a difficult thing to do sometimes because it disappoints people or it frightens people or something, and some people think it unwise. But I do think I don't want to be someone who is seen as cozy.
Yeah.
I like a light touch. One of the things I learned from the vicar of St Albans Home, in the first church I went to in adulthood, was a man called John Gaskell, who was a very formidable, brilliant, holy and learned and clever man. But he had the loveliest lightness of touch, and I do like that lightness of touch in the way I do this sort of thing. And I don't always have a light touch in other matters, but I try to have a light touch in how I go about engaging with the world, I guess.
And how you kind of take yourself, I suppose, taking yourself lightly is.
Well, I always remember Dame Edna Everage was telling Geoffrey Archer that it was good that he was able to make a joke about himself, because otherwise he might be missing the joke of the century, because he was not to take himself too seriously. Yeah, I think so. Although, things happen, life happens sometimes, and it gets sticky and messy.
And you've ministered to people when life gets sticky and messy, and you've seen people through a great deal of sorrow. You've seen a great deal of sorrow yourself, and you've recently lost David, your partner, and you've written a book which is coming out soon called The Madness of Grief.
Yeah.
About your experience. And I know one thing that people really struggle with is the idea that a loving God can allow unbelievably dreadful things to happen. Is your faith changing through your loss, do you think?
Yes, but not in that way. I mean, I've never felt that my faith in God equips me with a get out of jail free card. Every year in Lent, in Holy Week, on Good Friday, I look at the cross and I see what the consequence is of faithfulness to God. And if you were hoping for a pass from all that is terrible in life, you're not going to get it, So that doesn't come as a surprise. I mean, the fact that I find myself having to deal with that stuff comes as no surprise. What's different about it is that I'm used to dealing with other people's stuff. So I have a defined role, as we do as clergy, and we observe the chaos of the grief of other people, the madness of grief in other people. But our job is not to trespass on that. Our job is to get them through it and to try to kind of make sense of what's happening to them. When it happens to you, I mean, I know all that stuff. I've read the books, I've got the T-shirt. But when it happens to you, it's like you've been blown up. I said the thing it made me think of was that I'd been in a terrible accident and that I was winded and I was unable to walk and I was in pain and I couldn't really, except I had the appearance of, I remember the day David died, I went to the co-op because I needed to get, I'd been sort of 4 days with him in hospital before he died. And then I needed to get bread and milk and cheese, basic stuff. So I went to the co-op in Thrapston. And when I came out and got home, in my shopping bag, I had 3 kinds of Parmesan. So I was mad, you know. And so I started sort of writing. Well, I was posting actually on Facebook. It didn't occur to me that this might not be stuff to kind of take to social media because I just kept on doing what I normally did, which is, you know, I was in daily conversations with people through social media. So I kept doing that. And then a newspaper asked me to write a piece and I did. And then somebody said, well, why don't you just write this stuff down? So I did. I just wrote really in the eye of the storm implies there is a sort of quiet spot in the middle of that, but there isn't. I just wrote as it happened. And in a way I felt a bit like a war correspondent in that I was sort of standing on the street corner watching the bombs go off. Except I was a combatant in it as well, I guess. So that's what I did. When David was dying, I went to the chapel in the hospital. And my prayer was, I'm not going to be really available for much for the foreseeable future. So I'm just so you know, as it were. But and conventional piety has become a bit difficult, right? So people saying stuff that's intended to soothe, but actually it seems so banal. That wasn't much cop. I got a copy. I went away for a few days on my own with the dogs and went to, it was Hay on Wye, and I found a copy of In Memoriam with a lovely calfskin binding. It was beautiful, beautiful edition, wildly expensive in a secondhand bookshop, and I bought it. And I brought it back to the cottage I was staying in, and I thought, I cannot, my own grief is just too intractable, but I can read about Tennyson's grief and maybe that will match. And I started reading it. It just got within the first couple of pages, I got to a sort of quatrain of conventional piety, and I thought, nah, can't do it. So I put it down. And then I went out on the bike, and when I came back, Pongo had eaten it because calfskin to a dachshund is just built on. So he literally just chomped his way through this. On the day I bought it, this incredibly expensive and rare edition of In Memoriam, which I had to put on the fire in the end.
Eaten the conventional piety.
Yeah. But what doesn't change is I know that beyond what I feel and experience and the disruption of my life and the kind of shattered, the shattering of all sorts of things that happen when someone dies in that way, I knew that, you know, God would always be there and that it's not the end of the story. And I know that my Redeemer liveth and it's okay. That's okay.
You've written a book called Lives of the Improbable Saints. Fantastic. Who would be your modern day improbable saint?
Oh, that's a very good question. It's funny, I was talking, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because one of the points about saints is that they are firmly in the past. If they're distant in the past, you can kind of grant them their legends of levitating and bilocating and, I don't know, growing miraculous beards to defend their chastity, all that kind of thing. I love those stories. And, you know, the medieval mind made sense of the world in ways different from ours. I think it's harder when you get nearer to your own time and space because there's just perhaps too much on the lost side of the balance, if I can put it that way, to allow you to sustain the kind of saintly character of it. I mean, a person who had a huge impact on me was a chap called Mark Ashton, who, if you've seen the film Pride, Mark was an extraordinary person who was an activist from Northern Ireland who came to London to be gay. He was part of our circle of friends. We were all mates living around King's Cross at the time. And Mark was an extraordinary person. He'd grown up in a sectarian and divided world. And he was fiercely activist, but he never lost in all that his utter commitment to uphold the dignity of all people. So Mark was the person who, he was just really good fun to be with. There was nothing the least bit puritanical about him. He was really good fun. But he just really believed that we could do better. And he would, so he started a group during the miners' strike called Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners. It was a support group of London lesbians and gay men who adopted a pit village in the Delice Valley in South Wales. You couldn't have had two cultures which seemed more distant from each other. But Mark was the agent through which friendships were made then that have lasted all our lives, and really powerful, really meaningful friendships. And as a result of that, the miners used to come on gay pride marches, and it was just a great story. And Mark was just, had that sort of personality. He was also, we were friends. We used to run around London. We ran around New York a bit. We ran around Paris, and when I was in the band at the time. And we had a great time. And then Mark died of AIDS. He was the first of our circle to die of AIDS. So he was 26, and he had a cough on a Monday, and he died on the Friday of a form of pneumonia that just rampaged unstoppably through him because he had no immune system to fight it off. And it was a loss that was just horrendous. And it's interesting now, 30 years later, there's a park named after him in Paris, and there's a campaign at the moment to have a statue put up to him in his hometown, Portrush. And there's a blue plaque up to him in London, which is extraordinary to anyone who knew him then, the idea that Mark would be such an honoured person, but he deserved it. And I think it was, for me, the inspiration is he never lost. Even when the fight was at its most intense, he never surrendered that belief in the inalienable dignity of all people. And that's something that inspires me still.
Yeah. COVID has changed how a lot of us are thinking about almost everything, really, hasn't it? Everything's sort of thrown up in the air. What would you say to someone who was thinking for the first time about maybe joining in with something to do with church, either coming in person or joining in online, or, you know, what's the point to you? What would you say?
Well, I think we have a much bigger shop window now than we've ever had before, because of the amount of stuff that's now happening in this sort of format. So we're much more, no one has to walk through a door into an unfamiliar building. You know, people could just drop in and watch and monitor. And I think what they might take away from that is that the conversation we're having is the same conversation they're having, actually. We care about what they care about, and what's important to them is important to us too. But we have a certain idea about what we can say in response to those questions, and I think that's really good. I also think that one thing I've discovered is just how much I just miss community. And what we do, I mean, a place like Findon, the church is one of the biggest players here, and we've been involved. We sort of the Findon support team. It's not a church organisation, but lots of church people are involved in it. So all through the first lockdown, we were looking after people, doing their shopping, prescriptions, making sure that people who needed support were getting support when statutory bodies were failing. So that was all happening. Deeply invested in the schools here. We have a church school and an infant school. We, through one of our educational charities, we raised some money and we built a nursery school, because lots of our kids who came from the poor end of the parish were not performing so well as kids from the richer end of the parish by the time they got to school. So we wanted to give what we can to level that off a bit before people start formal education. And also we're building 50 new houses in Findon, because we have a housing shortage here. So through the housing association, which I'm involved with, we've done that. So I can do that as a vicar here, and with the connections I've got, with the way the church sits in this community. We don't just talk the talk. We really, really involve, the food bank, all that kind of stuff. So I think when people see what we do, I think that offers a challenge that people want to rise to. We've had a really, really terrible year, and lots of bad things have happened. What do we do? Well, one of the ways we can do is respond to that by rediscovering that community, I think, and leveraging the power of that community to produce these benefits that, there's a strong pulse to our heartbeat, strong heartbeat here in Findon, to the life of our community. It's strong and it's steady. And I think the Church of England does a lot of that, really. And I think we are not, I don't think it's really given due credit. We do, we act as honest brokers in communities, the length and breadth of Britain. We're involved in lots and lots of things. We have a bigger activist base than most of the political parties, actually, when you kind of work it out. But I think it's not exactly, I don't think we're given due credit for it. And maybe if people could find a way towards us as a result of COVID and as a result of kind of encountering us in a new way, that might be great.
Richard, thank you so much for sharing your story and your insights with us. The theme for this month's History Month is body, mind and spirit. And I think you've helped us to think about all of those. It's been really wonderful meeting you.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you.